Hello there and welcome back. Tonight we're diving deep beneath the waves to meet Poseidon, the god who controlled all the world's oceans but could never control his own tempestuous heart. This is the story of the eternal second son, jealousy, and learning that true power flows like water around obstacles rather than destroying them. Take a moment to settle in. Listen to that fire crackling, let its rhythm slow your breathing, and join me as we follow Poseidon through his entire immortal journey, from the baby almost eaten by his father to the wise god who finally learned his place in the cosmos. Our story begins not with triumph, but with darkness. Not with power, but with helplessness. Not in the vast oceans that would one day bow to his command, but in the cramped, acidic nightmare of his father's stomach. Picture, if you will, being born and immediately eaten by your own father. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally consumed like a midnight snack. Welcome to Poseidon's entrance into the world, a cosmic welcome party where the guest of honor gets swallowed before he can even cry. Poseidon was the second son of the Titans Cronus and Rhea, born into a family where dysfunction was spelled with capital letters and underlined in blood. His older brother Hades had already taken the express route down their father's gullet. His sisters Hestia, Demeter, and Hera had suffered the same fate. The family dinner table was less about gathering and more about one-way trips to digestive prison. Cronus, you see, had received a prophecy that one of his children would overthrow him, just as he had overthrown his own father Uranus. His solution to this cosmic HR problem was elegantly simple and absolutely horrifying: eat the employees before they could stage a corporate takeover. So when baby Poseidon emerged into the world, he experienced consciousness for exactly long enough to register the sensation of breathing before he was on his way down his father's throat, joining his siblings in the ultimate timeout, a place where time itself was digested and reformed. But here's where Poseidon's story takes its first crucial turn. Unlike his siblings, who were too young to remember much of anything before their impromptu relocation, Poseidon retained fragments of memory from his brief moment of freedom. The taste of air, the sensation of light on his skin, the feeling of existing as an individual rather than part of someone else's meal plan. These memories would haunt him for millennia. They gave him something his older siblings lacked: a burning awareness of what had been stolen from him. While Hades and the others could at least say they had never known anything else, Poseidon carried the psychological burden of remembering exactly what independence felt like before it was taken away. Inside Cronus's stomach, the divine siblings existed in a state that was neither life nor death, neither conscious nor unconscious. They were suspended in divine gastric juice, aging without growing, thinking without learning, being without becoming. It was the ultimate sensory deprivation chamber, designed by accident to create the perfect psychological conditions for brewing resentment. Poseidon floated in this acidic limbo, and with nothing else to do, he thought. He raged. He planned. But most importantly, he compared. Even in that dark, cramped space, he could sense his siblings around him. He could feel their divine essences, their developing personalities, their growing power. And already, even before any of them had drawn a free breath, Poseidon could tell that Zeus was different. The youngest sibling, when he eventually joined them in their father's stomach, carried himself differently. He radiated a confidence that seemed almost absurd given their circumstances. Where Poseidon felt trapped, Zeus seemed to feel temporarily delayed. Where Poseidon raged against their confinement, Zeus appeared to be studying it, learning from it, planning around it. This difference in temperament would define their relationship for eternity. Poseidon saw problems as personal attacks to be met with force. Zeus saw problems as puzzles to be solved with strategy. Even in the womb-like prison of their father's digestive system, these fundamental differences were already becoming apparent. Years passed, decades, maybe centuries. Time moves differently for immortal beings trapped inside other immortal beings. The siblings grew in power, if not in freedom, their divine natures developing despite their constrained circumstances. They learned to communicate through divine telepathy, sharing thoughts and emotions across the acidic void. It was during these conversations that Poseidon first experienced what would become his defining emotion: sibling rivalry. Not the garden variety competition you might remember from your own childhood, but the deep, cosmic jealousy that comes from being permanently overshadowed by someone you're supposed to love. Zeus, even as the youngest, somehow became the natural leader of their little trapped community. When disputes arose between the siblings, they instinctively looked to him for resolution. When plans were made for their eventual escape, Zeus naturally took charge of the strategy sessions. When hope needed to be maintained during their darkest moments, Zeus was the one who provided inspiring speeches about their destined freedom. Poseidon found this maddening. He was older than Zeus. He was just as powerful, just as intelligent, just as capable of leadership. So why did everyone, including their older siblings, defer to the baby of the family? The answer, though Poseidon wouldn't understand it for millennia, lay in the fundamental difference between force and influence. Poseidon commanded through power. When he spoke, you listened because you could feel the raw divine energy radiating from him like heat from a furnace. But Zeus led through charisma. When he spoke, you listened because something in his voice made you want to hear what he had to say. Both approaches have their merits, but in the cramped confines of their father's stomach, charisma proved more useful than raw power. You can't intimidate people into following you when everyone is equally trapped. You can only inspire them to believe that following you might lead to something better. And so, even before their eventual escape, the pattern was established. Zeus would lead, Poseidon would follow, and Poseidon would resent every moment of it while simultaneously being unable to figure out how to change the dynamic. The escape, when it finally came, only reinforced these roles. Zeus had somehow managed to communicate with their mother Rhea and coordinate a complex plan involving disguises, poison, and precise timing. When Cronus finally vomited up his divine children, it was Zeus who emerged first, Zeus who took charge of the situation, Zeus who rallied them for the war that everyone knew was coming. Poseidon emerged from their father's stomach feeling like he was waking up from the world's worst nightmare, only to discover that his little brother had somehow become the undisputed leader of their family revolution. The taste of freedom was sweet, but it was seasoned with the bitter realization that even liberation came with a hierarchy he hadn't chosen. Standing in the ruins of their father's palace, divine and furious and finally free, Poseidon looked at Zeus and felt something that would define their relationship forever. Love mixed with resentment, loyalty tainted with jealousy, and an unshakable awareness that no matter how powerful he became, he would always be the second son. The war against the Titans was about to begin, and Poseidon was ready to fight. But he was already fighting a second war, one that would last much longer and prove much harder to win, the war for recognition, respect, and the right to step out of his younger brother's shadow. Freedom tastes different when you've earned it versus when someone else has won it for you. Poseidon was learning this lesson as he stood in the wreckage of his father's throne room, watching Zeus naturally assume command of their newly liberated family. The Titanomachy, the war between the old gods and the new, was about to reshape the cosmos. But for Poseidon, it was also an opportunity. A chance to prove that he was every bit as capable as his younger brother. A chance to show that leadership wasn't Zeus's birthright, but something that could be earned through courage, strategy, and divine power. Unfortunately for Poseidon's ego, Zeus had a significant head start in the leadership department. While they had all been trapped in Cronus's stomach, Zeus had somehow managed to network. He had allies waiting, plans in motion, and a clear strategy for victory. Poseidon found himself in the position of joining Zeus's revolution rather than leading his own. This was Poseidon's first taste of what would become a lifelong pattern, arriving at the party to discover that Zeus had not only beaten him there, but had somehow become the host while he wasn't looking. The early days of the war were intoxicating for all the siblings. After eons of confinement, they were finally able to stretch their divine muscles, to explore the full extent of their powers, to act rather than simply exist. For Poseidon, it was like discovering that he had been living his entire life in a cramped closet when he was actually built for cathedrals. His domain, it turned out, was water. Not just any water, all water. Every ocean, every sea, every river, every raindrop, every tear. He could feel it all, connected to his consciousness like an extension of his nervous system. When he focused, he could sense a fisherman's boat bobbing on waves thousands of miles away. When he concentrated, he could feel every creature that swam in the dark depths of the sea. The discovery was overwhelming and magnificent. Poseidon had found his element, literally. Water responded to his emotions, his desires, his very thoughts. When he was calm, the seas were peaceful. When he was angry, storms erupted across the Mediterranean. When he was sad, rains fell to comfort the earth. But even this incredible revelation came with a sting. Zeus, it seemed, had claimed the sky, not just the air, but the weather, the clouds, the lightning, the very heavens themselves. And somehow, Zeus's domain felt larger, more impressive, more immediately visible to mortals who looked up rather than down. Poseidon controlled the vast majority of the Earth's surface. The oceans covered far more territory than the land. But Zeus controlled the sky, which was infinite. Poseidon ruled over the creatures of the deep, but Zeus commanded the storms that mortals saw every day. Poseidon's power was immense but hidden beneath the waves. Zeus's power was constantly on display for anyone who bothered to look up. Even in their areas of divine responsibility, Zeus had somehow managed to claim the more visible, more obviously impressive portfolio. The war itself gave Poseidon his first real chance to distinguish himself as something other than Zeus's older brother. The Titans were powerful, ancient, and absolutely committed to maintaining the old order. They had experience, established power bases, and the kind of cosmic authority that comes from ruling for eons. But they had grown complacent. They had forgotten what it felt like to be hungry for power, desperate for freedom, motivated by the kind of rage that only comes from being swallowed by your own father. Poseidon threw himself into the conflict with the fury of centuries of pent-up frustration. While Zeus played the diplomatic game, building alliances, negotiating with neutral parties, crafting the grand strategy, Poseidon became the revolution's most devastating weapon. He learned to weaponize water in ways that had never been imagined. Tsunamis that could level mountains. Underwater currents that could drag entire Titan armies to their doom. Storms that turned the sea itself into a battlefield where only he could navigate safely. But perhaps his most terrifying discovery was his connection to earthquakes. Water, it turned out, was deeply connected to the Earth's stability. By manipulating underground rivers and shifting oceanic pressure, Poseidon could literally make the ground shake. He could crack foundations, topple towers, and turn solid earth into liquid chaos. The other gods began calling him the Earthshaker, and Poseidon loved it. Finally, he had found something that was uniquely his, something that even Zeus couldn't do better. When Poseidon got angry, the very ground trembled. When he went to war, mountains fell into the sea. His performance in the Titanomachy was spectacular. Where Zeus provided leadership and strategy, Poseidon provided overwhelming force. Where Zeus inspired the troops, Poseidon terrorized the enemy. Where Zeus built alliances, Poseidon destroyed opposition. For the first time in his existence, Poseidon felt like he was the star of his own story rather than a supporting character in Zeus's epic. The other gods looked at him with a mixture of awe and fear that felt intoxicating after a lifetime of being overlooked. He saved entire battles through sheer divine force. When the Titans seemed to be gaining ground, Poseidon would arrive like a force of nature, quite literally reshaping the battlefield to favor the Olympians. He flooded enemy strongholds, created new islands to serve as strategic outposts, and turned the Mediterranean Sea into his personal highway for rapid troop deployment. The mortals caught in the crossfire of this cosmic war began to worship him with a fervor that was both terrifying and deeply satisfying. They built shrines on beaches, offered sacrifices before sea voyages, and told stories about the god who could make the earth itself bow to his will. But even in his moment of greatest triumph, Poseidon couldn't escape the shadow of his younger brother. Because while Poseidon was winning battles, Zeus was winning the war. While Poseidon was demonstrating overwhelming power, Zeus was demonstrating superior leadership. The final victory against Cronus came not through Poseidon's earth-shaking force, but through Zeus's careful strategy. The decisive moment involved Zeus's use of the Cyclopes' gifts, the thunder and lightning that would become his signature weapons. When Cronus finally fell, it was Zeus who struck the final blow, Zeus who accepted the surrender, Zeus who stood victorious over their defeated father. Poseidon had been instrumental in the victory. Without his contributions, the war might have been lost. But instruments don't get the glory conductors do. And Zeus, as always, had positioned himself as the conductor of their cosmic orchestra. As the dust settled and the Titans were chained in Tartarus, Poseidon found himself in a familiar position. Victorious but overshadowed, essential but secondary, powerful but not quite powerful enough to claim the recognition he craved. The war was over. The old order had been destroyed. A new age was about to begin, and the victorious gods needed to decide how to divvy up the universe they had just conquered. Poseidon looked at the cosmos spread out before them and felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. This was his chance to finally claim his rightful place as an equal to Zeus. This was his opportunity to prove that the older brother deserved just as much respect as the younger one. But deep down, in a place he didn't like to examine too closely, Poseidon was already beginning to suspect that equality might not be on the table. Zeus had led them to victory. Zeus had the loyalty of their siblings. Zeus had the kind of natural authority that seemed to make even the suggestion of shared leadership feel somehow wrong. The division of the universe was coming, and Poseidon was about to learn whether being the older brother meant anything when your younger sibling had already proven himself to be the natural king. The war was over, but the real battle was just beginning. Three brothers stood before the defeated cosmos, gods who had risked everything to overthrow their father and claim their place in the universal order. Now came the question that would define the rest of their immortal lives. Who rules what? Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades faced a decision that makes modern inheritance disputes look like playground squabbles. They had won the entire universe, but universe-sized prizes tend to create universe-sized problems. Someone had to be in charge of the sky. Someone had to govern the seas. Someone had to rule the underworld. And someone had to make sure this division didn't immediately spark another war. Zeus, with his trademark combination of wisdom and political cunning, suggested they draw lots. 3 equal chances. 3 equal outcomes. Perfect fairness decided by fate rather than favoritism. It was exactly the kind of solution that made Zeus such an effective leader, elegant, diplomatic, and seemingly impossible to argue with. Poseidon should have been suspicious. He should have realized that Zeus's solutions always seemed to work out surprisingly well for Zeus. But Poseidon was still riding high on his performance in the war, still believing that divine justice and family loyalty meant something, still convinced that surely this time things would be different. The lots were cast with all the ceremony befitting such a momentous decision. 3 equal shares of infinity, 3 chances to shape the future of existence itself. The universe held its breath as the brothers reached for their destinies. Zeus drew the sky vast, infinite, visible from everywhere, home to the clouds and storms and the very air that every living thing needed to survive. The heavens themselves, stretching endlessly upward, with no boundaries, no limits, no competition for space. Hades drew the underworld dark, mysterious, filled with untold riches and absolute authority over the realm where every mortal story eventually ended. The kingdom of the dead, where even other gods rarely dared to visit, making him the undisputed master of his domain. Poseidon drew the seas. At first glance, it seemed like a fair distribution. The oceans covered most of the Earth's surface. Sea life was incredibly diverse. Maritime trade was essential for civilization. The seas connected all lands, making Poseidon's domain arguably the most strategically important of the 3. But as Poseidon surveyed his new kingdom, he began to notice some troubling details. The seas were vast, yes, but they were also contained. Bounded by shores, limited by coastlines, defined by what they were not rather than what they were. Zeus's sky had no ceiling, no walls, no borders. It simply went on forever. Hades's underworld was hidden but unlimited, a vast realm of mystery and wealth. Poseidon's seas, magnificent as they were, had edges. Even worse, the seas were empty of the most interesting creatures in the cosmos, humans. Oh, mortals sailed on his waters, fished in his depths, and occasionally drowned in his storms. But they lived on the land, built their cities on the shore, and spent most of their time looking up at Zeus's sky rather than down into Poseidon's depths. The psychological impact of this division would haunt Poseidon for millennia. Zeus ruled the infinite heavens and, by extension, had natural authority over the weather that shaped mortal agriculture. Hades ruled the afterlife and, by extension, had authority over the ultimate fate of every living thing. Poseidon ruled the seas and, well, fish. It wasn't that fish were unimportant. It was that ruling fish didn't feel quite as cosmically significant as ruling the heavens or the afterlife. But the most painful realization came when Poseidon began to understand the political implications of their division. Zeus hadn't just won the sky. He had positioned himself as the natural mediator between the 3 realms. When disputes arose between the brothers, who would resolve them? The king of the sky, obviously. When cosmic decisions needed to be made that affected all 3 domains, who would have the final say? The ruler of the heavens, naturally. Zeus had drawn the lot that made him not just a co-ruler but the senior partner in their divine corporation. The lots had been fair, but the outcomes were anything but equal. Poseidon's first instinct was to object, to demand a redraw, to point out that the division wasn't actually as equitable as it appeared. But he faced a problem that would plague him throughout his reign. How do you complain about unfairness without looking like a sore loser? Zeus had played by the rules they had all agreed to, The lottery had been Zeus's idea, but it had been conducted fairly. Poseidon had drawn his lot from the same pool as his brothers. There was no evidence of cheating, no smoking gun of divine manipulation, no clear injustice to point to. There was just the gradually dawning realization that even when Zeus played fair, he somehow still managed to win. So Poseidon did what he would do countless times throughout his reign. He swallowed his objections, accepted his domain, and began the long, slow process of building resentment that would fuel his temper for millennia to come. He threw himself into ruling the seas with the kind of manic energy that comes from trying to prove a point. If Zeus thought the oceans were a lesser domain, Poseidon would show him exactly how wrong he was. If mortals wanted to focus on the sky, Poseidon would give them reasons to pay attention to the sea. He built an underwater palace that made Zeus's sky throne look modest by comparison. Coral spires that reached toward the surface like underwater mountains. Halls carved from pearl and decorated with treasures from every shipwreck in history. Gardens of sea anemone that bloomed in colors that had no names in any mortal language. He populated his realm with creatures that defied imagination. The hippocampi, horses that could swim through water as easily as their land-based cousins ran through fields. Dolphins with human-level intelligence who served as his messengers and advisors. Mermaids and tritons who sang his praises and enforced his will throughout the ocean's depths. He mastered his powers until he could reshape coastlines with a thought, summon storms that could sink entire fleets, and create islands where none had existed before. When Poseidon was angry, tsunamis reshaped continents. When he was pleased, calm seas blessed every voyage. But no matter how magnificent his underwater kingdom became, no matter how awe-inspiring his powers proved to be, Poseidon couldn't shake the feeling that he was ruling a magnificent backwater while Zeus governed the center of the universe. The problem wasn't that the seas were unimportant. The problem was that they were invisible to most of the cosmos most of the time. Zeus's domain was constantly on display. Every time a mortal looked up, they saw the sky. Every storm, every sunset, every cloud was a reminder of Zeus's power and authority. Poseidon's domain was vast and beautiful and essential to life on Earth, but it was hidden beneath the waves where only sea creatures and the occasional drowned sailor could appreciate its majesty. This visibility gap became a source of constant frustration. Zeus didn't have to work to maintain his public profile. His domain marketed itself. Poseidon, meanwhile, had to actively intervene in mortal affairs to remind people that he existed. Hence the storms, the earthquakes, the occasional dramatic destruction of ships whose captains had failed to offer proper sacrifices. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was divine marketing. Poseidon had to make himself visible through spectacle because his natural domain was inherently hidden from view. The division of the cosmos had been fair in letter but not in spirit. Zeus had won the lottery of public relations, while Poseidon had inherited the challenge of ruling from the shadows. And so began Poseidon's eternal struggle to claim his rightful place in the cosmic hierarchy, to prove that ruling the seas was just as important as ruling the sky, and to step out of his younger brother's shadow into recognition that felt perpetually just out of reach. The lottery had been cast. The domains had been divided. The new age had begun. But for Poseidon, every sunrise over his vast ocean kingdom was also a reminder of Zeus's infinite sky stretching endlessly above him, and every wave that crashed against the shore sounded like applause for a performance that no one was watching. The fire crackles lower now, settling into steady warmth as we dive deeper into Poseidon's story. He had his domain, his power, his underwater kingdom. But having something and proving it matters are two very different challenges. Poseidon faced a problem that every middle manager in history would recognize. How do you establish authority when everyone's looking at your boss instead of you? Zeus had the sky, the obvious throne, the natural spotlight. Poseidon had the depths, magnificent, powerful, and almost completely invisible to the people whose opinions mattered most. So he did what any ambitious ruler would do. He decided to make himself impossible to ignore. Poseidon's first major construction project was his palace, and calling it ambitious would be like calling the Grand Canyon a small ditch. He chose a location in the deepest part of the Mediterranean, where the pressure would have crushed any mortal structure instantly. Here, in the abyss where sunlight had never touched, he began building a monument to divine ego. The palace rose from the seafloor like a mountain range of pure ostentation. Spires of living coral that grew into impossible architectural forms. Halls carved from single massive pearls, each one larger than a mortal temple. Gardens of sea anemones that bloomed in colors that didn't exist on land, tended by nymphs whose beauty made mortal princesses look like rough sketches. The throne room alone was a marvel of divine engineering. A vast chamber with walls of transparent crystal that offered panoramic views of the ocean floor. Bioluminescent creatures swam in patterns around the ceiling like living constellations. The throne itself was carved from a single piece of coral that had been growing for millennia, shaped by Poseidon's will into a seat that made Zeus's sky throne look like outdoor furniture. But impressive architecture wasn't enough. Poseidon needed citizens worthy of his underwater empire. So he began creating life forms that would serve both as subjects and as advertisements for his creative powers. The hippocampi were his first masterpiece, horses that could gallop through water as easily as their land-based cousins ran through fields. These weren't just aquatic horses. They were symbols of Poseidon's ability to take Zeus's beloved land animals and improve them for his domain. Where Zeus had regular horses, Poseidon had horses that could breathe underwater, travel at impossible speeds through the depths, and serve as living proof that the seas were not just a watery version of the land, but something entirely superior. Then came the dolphins, enhanced with intelligence that rivaled the gods themselves. These became Poseidon's ambassadors and advisors, capable of complex reasoning and diplomatic missions. When Poseidon needed to communicate with distant parts of his realm, dolphins carried his messages. When he needed counsel, dolphins offered perspectives that were uniquely aquatic. They were living proof that the seas could produce wisdom that the sky could never match. The mermaids and tritons were perhaps his most political creation. Half human, half fish, they served as bridges between Poseidon's underwater realm and the surface world. Beautiful enough to enchant any mortal sailor, powerful enough to sink ships when necessary, they were Poseidon's way of extending his influence into Zeus's domain of air and Hades's realm of mortal death. These sea people became the face of Poseidon's public relations campaign. When sailors told stories in taverns, they spoke of encounters with these magnificent creatures. When poets composed epics, they included scenes of underwater kingdoms ruled by beings of impossible beauty. Slowly, carefully, Poseidon was building a mythology that positioned the seas not as Zeus's supporting cast, but as the main event. But Poseidon's most ambitious project was redesigning the ocean itself. The seas that mortals saw were just the surface layer of a much more complex reality. Beneath the waves, Poseidon created a three-dimensional civilization with cities at different depths, each designed for different purposes. Near the surface, he built trading posts where sea people could interact with surface dwellers. These became the basis for countless mortal stories about underwater kingdoms just beyond the reach of human exploration. In the middle depths, he established manufacturing centers where his subjects created items of impossible beauty and utility. Jewelry that would never tarnish, weapons that could cut through any material, tools that worked equally well in air or water. In the deepest parts of the ocean, he built archives and temples where the history of the seas was recorded and the mysteries of water itself were studied. These became centers of learning that rivaled anything Zeus had established in the sky. The result was a civilization that was both hidden and omnipresent. Every body of water, from the smallest stream to the vastest ocean, was connected to Poseidon's empire. Every creature that swam was potentially one of his subjects or messengers. Every storm at sea was a reminder of his power. Yet despite all this magnificent construction, all this creative energy, all this obvious divine power, Poseidon still faced the fundamental problem of visibility. Zeus's domain advertised itself every time someone looked up. Poseidon's empire remained largely invisible unless you were willing to dive beneath the surface. This led to Poseidon's first major public relations campaign, the storm. If mortals wouldn't look down into his depths, he would bring his depths up to their attention. Poseidon began orchestrating weather events that made it impossible to ignore the power of the seas. Hurricanes that redrew coastlines, tsunamis that demonstrated the ocean's ability to reach far inland, waterspouts that literally brought the sea into the sky, making it impossible for anyone to claim that Zeus alone controlled the heavens. These weren't random acts of destruction. They were carefully planned demonstrations of power, designed to shift the cosmic conversation from Zeus controls the weather to Zeus and Poseidon share control of the weather, and Poseidon's part might actually be more impressive. The strategy worked, sort of. Mortals began paying much more attention to Poseidon. Coastal cities built temples in his honor. Sailors offered sacrifices before every voyage. Fishermen prayed to him for good catches and calm seas. But success brought its own problems. Poseidon discovered that being feared was not the same as being respected, and that attention gained through destruction was not the same as attention earned through leadership. Worse, his dramatic demonstrations of power were beginning to concern his fellow gods. Zeus, in particular, was not amused by Poseidon's weather interventions. The sky was Zeus's domain, and storms that originated in the sea but affected the land and air were uncomfortably close to trespassing on his brother's territory. This led to Poseidon's first major political crisis as an independent ruler. Zeus didn't forbid him from creating storms. He couldn't, really, since the seas were legitimately Poseidon's domain. But Zeus began responding to Poseidon's storms with counter-weather, essentially turning every meteorological event into a subtle power struggle between the brothers. When Poseidon sent a hurricane toward a coast, Zeus might redirect it with high-pressure winds. When Poseidon created perfect calm for his favored sailors, Zeus might send them helpful tailwinds that made it unclear who deserved the credit. When Poseidon demonstrated his power with dramatic waterspouts, Zeus might counter with equally dramatic lightning displays that reminded everyone who really controlled the sky. These weather wars were exhausting for both brothers and confusing for mortals, who never knew whether the storm that sank their ship was divine judgment, divine politics, or just divine brothers having an argument. Poseidon realized he needed a different approach. Raw power demonstrations were getting him attention, but they were also getting him into conflicts with Zeus that he couldn't win. He needed a way to establish his importance that didn't directly challenge his brother's authority. The solution came to him while he was brooding in his throne room, watching schools of fish swim in perfect formation around his palace spires. The fish moved with such precision, such beauty, such obvious intelligence that they put most mortal armies to shame. Here was power that was clearly his, obviously impressive, and completely outside Zeus's ability to replicate. Poseidon began developing what would become his signature contribution to the cosmic order: mastery over life itself, specifically life in his domain. While Zeus ruled from a distance and Hades dealt primarily with death, Poseidon would become the god of abundance, fertility, and the creative force that filled his realm with wonders. He started small, perfecting his ability to encourage marine life. Fish populations exploded in his favored waters. Coral reefs grew into underwater forests of impossible beauty. New species emerged regularly, each one more magnificent than the last. Then he expanded his focus to include all water-related life. Rivers began teeming with fish. Lakes became havens for waterfowl. Even the smallest streams supported ecosystems of remarkable complexity and beauty. Mortals began to notice that Poseidon's favor didn't just mean safe passage across his waters. It meant abundance beyond imagination. Fishermen who honored him properly brought home catches that could feed entire villages. Farmers whose fields were blessed by his rivers enjoyed harvests that seemed to multiply themselves. This was power that even Zeus had to respect. Creating storms was impressive, but creating life was divine in the truest sense. Poseidon wasn't just showing off his ability to destroy, he was demonstrating his capacity to nurture, to build, to contribute something positive to the cosmic order. For the first time since the lottery that divided the universe, Poseidon felt like he had found his true calling. Not as Zeus's perpetually frustrated older brother, not as the god of dramatic weather events, but as the source of abundance, the force that made the waters of the world into sources of life rather than barriers to it. He was still the ruler of the seas, still the earthshaker, still the powerful god who could sink ships with a gesture. But now he was also something more: the provider, the creator, the divine force that made the difference between a barren ocean and a sea teeming with life. It was a role that felt worthy of a god, and for the first time in his immortal existence, Poseidon began to feel like he might be building something that could stand proudly alongside Zeus's achievements rather than in competition with them. But as any politician knows, public approval and family harmony are two very different challenges. And Poseidon was about to discover that success in his own domain was just the beginning of his struggles with divine politics. Listen to those flames settle into embers. Even fire knows when to quiet down and let a story breathe. Poseidon was beginning to find his groove as a creator god, master of abundance, ruler of life-giving waters. But success has a way of making you confident, and confidence has a way of making you take risks you probably shouldn't. The city of Cecropia was growing into something special. Perched on a rocky peninsula overlooking the sea, it had the potential to become one of the great centers of human civilization. The people were clever, industrious, and strategically located to become major players in Mediterranean trade. There was just one problem: they needed a patron god. In the ancient world, cities didn't just happen. They required divine sponsorship, protection, and guidance. A city without a patron god was like a startup without investors, technically possible, but practically doomed. The people of Cecropia had been praying to various gods, hedging their bets while they waited to see which divine power would take an interest in their future. It was a smart strategy, but it couldn't last forever. Eventually, they would need to choose a primary patron, and that choice would shape their destiny for generations. Poseidon looked at Cecropia and saw opportunity. Here was a chance to establish himself as the patron of what could become a great city. Not just any city, but a maritime power that would serve as a showcase for everything the seas could offer civilization. The location was perfect for his purposes. Cecropia was surrounded by water on three sides, making it naturally dependent on the sea for trade, food, and protection. The people were already skilled sailors and fishermen. They understood the power of the ocean and respected it appropriately. Most importantly, Cecropia was close enough to Zeus's sphere of influence to matter, but far enough from his primary concerns to avoid immediate conflict. It felt like the perfect opportunity for Poseidon to establish a major center of worship without stepping directly on his brother's toes. Poseidon began courting the Cecropians with characteristic enthusiasm. He calmed the seas around their peninsula, ensuring safe passage for their trading vessels. He filled their waters with fish so abundant that their nets could barely contain the catch. He guided their ships away from storms and toward favorable winds. The response was everything he had hoped for. The Cecropians began building a temple in his honor. Priests were appointed to maintain proper sacrifices. Festivals were planned to celebrate his generosity. It looked like Poseidon had finally found his signature city, the place where his worship would be centered and his influence would be most clearly demonstrated. That's when Athena showed up. Athena had been watching Cecropia's development with interest of her own. As the goddess of wisdom, crafts, and strategic warfare, she saw the city's potential differently than Poseidon did. Where he saw a maritime trading center, she saw a place where human intelligence and creativity could flourish. Where he saw a showcase for the abundance of the seas, she saw a laboratory for the advancement of civilization itself. The problem was that both gods had legitimate claims to the city. Poseidon could point to the obvious maritime advantages he provided. Athena could point to the intelligence and skill that made the Cecropians successful in the first place. Rather than fight over the city or let the dispute fester into a larger conflict, the other gods suggested a competition. Both Poseidon and Athena would offer a gift to the people of Cecropia. The Cecropians themselves would judge which gift was more valuable, and the winner would become their primary patron. It seemed fair, civilized, and appropriately dramatic. What could go wrong? Poseidon approached the competition with confidence bordering on arrogance. He was older than Athena, more powerful in raw terms, and his connection to the city's maritime nature seemed obvious. Plus, he had been courting the Cecropians for months while Athena was a relative newcomer to their affairs. The competition was held on the Acropolis, the highest point of the city, with the entire population gathered to witness this historic moment. Representatives from other cities came to watch. Even some of the gods attended, curious to see how this unprecedented contest would unfold. Poseidon went first, which in retrospect might have been a tactical error. He raised his trident high above his head, channeling all his power over earth and sea into a single dramatic gesture. The ground beneath the Acropolis cracked open, and from the fissure erupted a spring of water. It was magnificent. Water flowing freely from solid rock, in a city where fresh water was always precious. The crowd gasped in amazement as the spring bubbled up, clear and cool and apparently endless. Poseidon smiled as he watched the Cecropians' reaction. This was exactly the kind of practical, immediate benefit that mortals appreciated. Fresh water was life itself. No city could survive without it, and here he was providing an unlimited supply flowing directly from the sacred center of their community. But then someone tasted the water. It was salt water. Pure, clean, perfectly drinkable salt water if you happen to be a fish. Poseidon had created a magnificent spring of completely useless water in a city that desperately needed fresh water for drinking, cooking, and agriculture. It was a gift that demonstrated tremendous power while providing absolutely no practical benefit. The crowd's enthusiasm turned to polite confusion. They appreciated the demonstration of divine might, certainly. The spring was beautiful and clearly supernatural. But what exactly were they supposed to do with it? Athena stepped forward, and where Poseidon had been dramatic, she was subtle. Where he had been powerful, she was practical. Where he had focused on spectacle, she focused on utility. She knelt down and planted something small in the rocky ground of the Acropolis. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then, slowly, a green shoot emerged from the earth. It grew steadily, reaching toward the sky, developing leaves, branches, and finally bearing fruit. It was an olive tree. The first olive tree. And it was perfect. The crowd gathered around the tree, examining this strange new plant. The fruit was edible. Not just edible, but delicious and nutritious. The oil could be extracted for cooking, for lighting lamps, for preserving food. The wood could be used for construction. The leaves never fell, providing year-round shade. But the genius of Athena's gift wasn't just in the tree itself. It was in what the tree represented: sustainable abundance. Poseidon's spring, impressive as it was just a spring. Athena's tree would bear fruit year after year, generation after generation. It would provide seeds that could be planted elsewhere, spreading this new form of abundance beyond Cecropia to benefit all of humanity. Where Poseidon had given them a demonstration of power, Athena had given them a tool for civilization. The vote wasn't even close. The Cecropians chose Athena as their patron, and their city took a new name in her honor: Athens. Poseidon's reaction was about what you'd expect from someone who had just been publicly humiliated by his younger, technically adopted niece in front of half the ancient world. He was furious. Not just disappointed or frustrated, but cosmically, earth-shakingly, tsunami-summoning furious. The sea around Athens began to churn. The ground beneath the city started to tremble. Storm clouds gathered overhead as Poseidon's rage built toward what looked like a very destructive tantrum. The Athenians, who had just chosen wisdom over power, were about to learn what happened when you made the god of earthquakes and storms feel unappreciated. But before Poseidon could unleash his full wrath, Zeus intervened. Not dramatically, not with thunderbolts or cosmic authority, but with the kind of quiet word that older brothers sometimes need to hear from younger ones. "You're not really angry at them," Zeus pointed out. "You're angry that your gift wasn't as good as hers." It was true, and Poseidon knew it. The Athenians had made a reasonable choice based on the options presented to them. Athena's gift had simply been more useful than his. Being furious at the judges for choosing the better option was like being angry at the ocean for being wet. But acknowledging that his gift had been inferior felt almost worse than losing the competition itself. It meant that the problem wasn't politics or prejudice or family favoritism. The problem was that when it really mattered, when he had a chance to prove his worth in direct competition with another god, he had failed not through bad luck but through bad judgment. Poseidon gradually calmed the seas and stilled the earthquakes. Athens would not suffer for choosing Athena, at least not from him. But the sting of defeat would linger for centuries. The contest for Athens became a defining moment in Poseidon's understanding of his place in the cosmic order. He was powerful, certainly. He was important, obviously. But power and importance weren't the same as wisdom, and wisdom was apparently what mortals valued most when choosing their divine patrons. Athena hadn't won because she was Zeus's daughter or because the contest was rigged. She had won because she understood what the Athenians actually needed better than Poseidon did. She had offered them a gift that would improve their lives for generations, while he had offered them a demonstration of his ability to break rocks. It was a lesson in leadership that Poseidon should have learned during the Titanomachy but had somehow missed. Impressive displays of power are less valuable than practical solutions to real problems. The irony was that Poseidon actually understood this principle when it came to his own domain. His work with marine ecosystems, his development of sea life abundance, his creation of sustainable underwater civilizations, these were all examples of wisdom applied to practical problems. But when he had a chance to showcase this wisdom to a mortal audience, he had defaulted to showing off his power instead of demonstrating his insight. Athens would go on to become one of the greatest cities in human history, a center of learning, democracy, and culture that would influence civilization for millennia. Every time someone mentioned Athenian wisdom, philosophy, or achievement, it was an indirect reminder that when Poseidon had competed directly with Athena for influence over human civilization, he had been found wanting. The contest for Athens taught Poseidon something important about the difference between being feared and being revered, between commanding respect and earning it, between power that impresses and power that serves. But it would take him much longer to figure out how to apply these lessons to his ongoing competition with Zeus. The fire's burning low now, casting dancing shadows that seem to move with the rhythm of waves against a distant shore. Poseidon had lost Athens, learned some hard lessons about wisdom versus power, and was beginning to understand that being a god was more complicated than simply being the strongest person in the room. Unfortunately, understanding something intellectually and managing it emotionally are two very different challenges. And Poseidon was about to discover that having a cosmic temper comes with cosmic consequences. The problem with being the god of earthquakes and storms is that your emotions have immediate, visible, and often devastating effects on the world around you. When a mortal has a bad day, they might snap at their family or eat too much ice cream. When Poseidon had a bad day, entire coastlines got redesigned. This became apparent in the aftermath of the Athens incident. Despite his promise to Zeus that he wouldn't punish the Athenians for choosing Athena, Poseidon found that his subconscious wasn't as forgiving as his conscious mind wanted to be. He would be going about his normal business managing sea currents, overseeing marine life, conducting the daily administration of ruling the oceans, when something would remind him of the contest. Maybe he'd see a ship flying Athenian colors. Maybe he'd notice merchants trading Athenian olive oil. Maybe he'd just hear someone mention Athens in conversation. And suddenly, without any conscious decision, the seas around Athens would get a little rougher. The winds would shift unfavorably for Athenian ships. Fishing nets would come up empty. Nothing dramatic enough to be considered divine punishment, just a consistent pattern of minor inconveniences that made life harder for the people who had rejected him. Zeus noticed first, of course. Zeus always noticed these things. "You're doing it again," he mentioned during one of their periodic divine family dinners. "Doing what?" Poseidon asked, though he knew perfectly well what Zeus meant. The passive-aggressive weather patterns around Athens. "You promised you wouldn't punish them." "I'm not punishing them," Poseidon protested. "I'm just not going out of my way to help them anymore." "Your definition of not helping seems to involve a lot of unfortunate coincidences," Zeus observed. It was true, and Poseidon knew it. But admitting that he was unconsciously sabotaging Athens would also mean admitting that he was still bothered by losing the contest, which would also mean admitting that Athena's victory had gotten under his skin more than he wanted to acknowledge. The conversation highlighted a fundamental problem with Poseidon's psychological makeup. He had never learned to process rejection or disappointment in healthy ways. As a god, he was used to getting what he wanted through sheer force of will. When that didn't work, his default response was to escalate the force rather than questioning whether he wanted the right things in the first place. This pattern became more apparent as Poseidon dealt with other frustrations in his divine career. When mortals failed to offer proper sacrifices, he didn't just withdraw his protection. He actively made their lives miserable with storms and earthquakes. When other gods disagreed with his decisions, he didn't argue his case. He demonstrated his power until they backed down or Zeus intervened. The most spectacular example of this came with the story of King Laomedon of Troy. Laomedon had commissioned Poseidon and Apollo to build walls around his city. It was a prestigious project, and both gods had put considerable effort into creating fortifications that were both impregnable and beautiful. When the work was finished, however, Laomedon refused to pay the agreed-upon fee. Apollo's response was measured and proportional. He sent a plague to Troy that would continue until Laomedon honored his agreement. Poseidon's response was less measured. He sent a sea monster. Not just any sea monster, but a creature of such size and ferocity that it could swallow ships whole and reshape coastlines with its movements. The monster didn't just threaten Troy, it made the entire region uninhabitable by terrorizing every fishing village, merchant ship, and coastal settlement within 100 miles of the city. When the other gods pointed out that this was somewhat excessive punishment for a contract dispute, Poseidon's defense was characteristically straightforward. He should have paid what he owed. Yes, Zeus agreed, but destroying half the eastern Mediterranean seems like overkill. I warned him what would happen if he didn't pay, Poseidon replied. It's not my fault he didn't take the warning seriously. This was technically true but missed the larger point. Poseidon's warnings tended to be along the lines of "pay me or something bad will happen," followed by something catastrophically bad happening. He never scaled his responses to match the offense. In his mind, any challenge to his authority deserved a response that would ensure it never happened again. The sea monster eventually had to be killed by the hero Heracles as part of his labors, but not before it had caused massive disruption to maritime trade and established Poseidon's reputation as a god with serious anger management issues. The pattern repeated itself across the ancient world. Sailors who forgot to pour wine into the sea before setting sail found themselves battling storms that seemed personally vindictive. Cities that built harbors without consulting Poseidon's priests discovered that their new ports had a tendency to be destroyed by surprisingly targeted earthquakes. Poseidon's fellow gods began to dread his involvement in any dispute, because his solutions tended to create more problems than they solved. While other gods might curse someone with bad luck or minor misfortunes, Poseidon's curses reshaped geography. The worst part was that Poseidon genuinely didn't understand why everyone found his responses excessive. From his perspective, he was simply being clear about the consequences of disrespecting divine authority. If mortals wanted to avoid tsunamis, they should avoid angering the god who controlled them. If they wanted calm seas, they should honor the god who provided them. It seemed perfectly logical to him. The fact that his proportional responses involved forces of nature that could affect thousands of innocent people didn't factor into his calculations. When you're a god whose emotions can literally move mountains, the temptation to solve problems through applied geology is apparently irresistible. This tendency towards what modern psychologists might call emotional dysregulation became a defining characteristic of Poseidon's reign. He was capable of great kindness and generosity when properly honored and respected. Sailors who followed proper protocols found their voyages blessed with favorable winds and calm seas. Cities that built beautiful temples in his honor enjoyed abundance from both the sea and the earth. But cross him, ignore him, or fail to show proper respect, and the consequences were swift, severe, and often completely disproportionate to the original offense. But cross him, ignore him, or fail to show proper respect, and the consequences were swift, severe, and often completely disproportionate to the original offense. The other gods eventually developed informal protocols for dealing with Poseidon's temper. When he started getting agitated, someone would quietly alert Zeus, who would usually intervene before things got too destructive. When Poseidon's emotions started affecting weather patterns, Athena or Apollo would often suggest alternative solutions that allowed him to save face while backing down from his more extreme positions. It was divine anger management, conducted on a cosmic scale with geological consequences. But the real tragedy wasn't the destruction Poseidon caused when he lost his temper. The real tragedy was how his reputation for explosive anger undermined his other accomplishments. He was genuinely brilliant at many aspects of divine governance. His management of marine ecosystems was masterful. His creation of new life forms was inspired. His development of underwater civilizations was innovative and successful. But all of that got overshadowed by his tendency to solve problems with earthquakes. Mortals remembered the god who could sink their ships more vividly than the god who filled their nets with fish. Other gods respected his power but approached him cautiously, always wondering whether they might accidentally trigger one of his famous outbursts. Poseidon had become victim of his own psychological patterns. His anger was his most visible trait, even though it wasn't necessarily his most important one. And like many people whose emotions run hot, he found that reputation for volatility made it harder to be taken seriously when he was actually being reasonable. The irony was that Poseidon's anger usually came from a place of genuine hurt or frustration. He got upset when people ignored him because he genuinely wanted to help them. He escalated conflicts because he felt like his legitimate concerns weren't being heard. He responded to disrespect with overwhelming force because he was tired of being overlooked or dismissed. But intentions don't matter much when the results involved tsunamis. Poseidon was slowly learning that being a god meant more than just having divine power. It meant learning to wield that power responsibly, proportionally, and with consideration for consequences that extended far beyond the immediate situation. It was a lesson that would take him centuries to fully internalize, and even then, he would still struggle with the gap between understanding what he should do and actually doing it when his emotions were running high. The fire settles into glowing coals as we watch Poseidon grapple with perhaps the most human of divine problems. How to be powerful without being destructive, how to demand respect without inspiring fear, and how to turn the force of your emotions into something constructive rather than catastrophic. Some lessons, it seems, are hard even for gods to learn. The embers glow steady now, casting warm light as our story turns towards something unexpected moments when Poseidon's tempestuous nature led not to destruction, but to creation. Because even the angriest gods sometimes channel their passion into something beautiful. The story begins with Demeter, goddess of the harvest, and Poseidon's most complicated romantic pursuit. This wasn't just another divine affair. This was Poseidon falling genuinely, completely, obsessively in love with someone who wanted absolutely nothing to do with him. Demeter had enough problems without adding Poseidon's romantic attention to the list. As goddess of agriculture, she was responsible for feeding the entire mortal world. Every crop failure, every famine, every bad harvest was ultimately her responsibility. The last thing she needed was a lovesick sea god disrupting her work with increasingly desperate courtship attempts. But Poseidon had never learned to take no for an answer gracefully. When Demeter politely declined his initial advances, he interpreted this as a challenge rather than a rejection. When she continued to refuse him, he decided what she really needed was a more impressive demonstration of his worthiness. This led to one of the most prolonged and elaborate courtship campaigns in divine history. Poseidon began by trying to impress Demeter with displays of his power over water. He created new rivers that would irrigate her favorite agricultural regions. He sent gentle rains to water her sacred groves. He calmed the seas so that ships carrying grain could travel safely between growing regions. Demeter appreciated these gestures but made it clear that professional courtesy wasn't the same as romantic interest. She thanked him for his help with agricultural water management while firmly maintaining that their relationship was purely collegial. Poseidon, however, was not deterred. If practical assistance wasn't working, perhaps what Demeter needed was something more personal, more creative, more uniquely suited to her individual tastes and interests. He began studying everything about her preferences, her habits, her domains of responsibility, her aesthetic sensibilities. He learned that she loved all growing things but had a particular fondness for creatures that helped with agricultural work. He discovered that she valued innovation and creativity, especially when applied to practical problems. And slowly, an idea began to form. What if he could create something entirely new? Something that would be useful to Demeter's work while also demonstrating his own creative powers? Something that would prove he wasn't just a god of destruction and storms, but a force of innovation and inspiration. Poseidon retreated to his deepest underwater workshop and began experimenting. He was going to create a new form of life, something that had never existed before, something perfect for Demeter's needs and beautiful enough to win her heart. The project took months. Poseidon worked with divine clay mixed with seawater, shaping and reshaping forms that looked almost right but not quite perfect. He was trying to create a creature that combined the best qualities of several different animals: the strength of a bull, the grace of a deer, the loyalty of a dog, the intelligence of a dolphin. But every prototype failed in some crucial way. Too weak, too clumsy, too aggressive, too stupid. Poseidon found himself learning the hard way that creation was much more difficult than destruction. Building something new required patience, precision, and a kind of sustained creative vision that was very different from the explosive power he was used to wielding. The breakthrough came when he stopped trying to combine existing animals and started thinking about what Demeter actually needed. She needed a creature that could help with heavy agricultural work but was gentle enough to work closely with humans. Strong enough to pull plows and carry loads, but intelligent enough to follow complex instructions. Fast enough to cover long distances quickly, but steady enough to work all day without tiring. And beautiful. The creature had to be beautiful, because this was ultimately a gift for the goddess he loved, and anything offered to Demeter needed to be worthy of her aesthetic standards. From this combination of practical requirements and romantic inspiration, Poseidon created the horse. The first horse emerged from his workshop like a living poem written in muscle and bone. It was larger than any land animal mortals had seen, but graceful rather than clumsy. Powerful but gentle. Intelligent enough to form bonds with humans but independent enough to survive in the wild. Most importantly, horses were perfect partners for agricultural societies. They could pull plows through heavy soil that would exhaust human farmers. They could carry harvested grain to distant markets. They could transport people quickly across the vast distances that separated growing regions. But Poseidon hadn't just created a useful animal. He had created something genuinely beautiful. The way horses moved was like watching water flow over land, smooth, powerful, hypnotic. Their manes flowed like waves, their muscles rippled like currents. Their speed created the same exhilarating sensation as riding a ship through wind and spray. When Poseidon presented the first horse to Demeter, she was speechless. Here was a gift that was simultaneously practical and poetic, useful and beautiful, innovative and perfect for her needs. It demonstrated that Poseidon understood her work, respected her challenges, and possessed creative abilities that went far beyond his reputation for destructive temper tantrums. For a moment, it seemed like Poseidon's patient courtship might actually succeed. Demeter was genuinely moved by the thoughtfulness and artistry of his gift. She could see the months of careful work that had gone into creating something so perfectly suited to her needs. But then she made a crucial observation that changed everything. "They're beautiful," she said, watching the horses graze in a meadow near her temple. "But they're not quite right for mortal farmers." Poseidon was confused. The horses were exactly what she had said she needed: strong, intelligent, beautiful creatures that could revolutionize agriculture. "They're too large," Demeter explained. "Too expensive to feed. Too powerful for small farms. Most mortals won't be able to afford to keep them, and those who can will use them for warfare rather than farming." She was right, and Poseidon knew it. In his enthusiasm to create the most impressive gift possible, he had designed horses for gods rather than mortals. They were magnificent, but they were also luxury items that would primarily benefit wealthy rulers and military commanders. "But I can fix that," Poseidon said quickly. "I can make smaller versions, more practical ones, breeds that are better suited to different kinds of work." Demeter smiled sadly. "I know you can. And I'm sure you will. But Poseidon, that's not really the point." She was rejecting him. Not because his gift wasn't impressive enough, not because he hadn't shown sufficient creativity or understanding of her needs, but because she simply didn't feel the same way about him that he felt about her. It was the kind of rejection that can't be fixed with grander gestures or more impressive demonstrations of devotion. It was the gentle, devastating rejection that comes when someone appreciates everything you've done for them but still doesn't want to build a life with you. Poseidon's first instinct was anger. All that work, all that creativity, all that patient courtship, and she was still saying no? It felt like a betrayal of everything he had invested in winning her love. But then he looked at the horses again, and something unexpected happened. His anger transformed into pride. He had created something genuinely new and beautiful. Something that would benefit mortals for generations. Something that proved he was capable of construction rather than just destruction, innovation rather than just intimidation. The horses were a masterpiece, regardless of whether they won him Demeter's heart. They were proof that Poseidon could channel his passionate nature into creation rather than destruction, that his emotional intensity could produce beauty rather than chaos. So instead of responding to Demeter's rejection with earthquakes and storms, Poseidon did something unprecedented. He accepted it gracefully. "You're right," he said. "They're not perfect for mortal farmers. But they're still worth making." And he kept working on them. Not to win Demeter's love anymore, but because the project itself had become rewarding. He created different breeds of horses, smaller ones for farming, faster ones for travel, stronger ones for heavy work. He experimented with colors and temperaments and specialized abilities. Horses became Poseidon's signature contribution to the mortal world. Not because they won him romance, but because they represented something new in his divine career, creation for its own sake rather than creation as a means to an end. The irony was that this shift in motivation made Poseidon more attractive to everyone, including Demeter. When he stopped pursuing her desperately and started focusing on his own creative projects, their relationship became easier and more genuinely friendly. She began consulting with him on agricultural challenges. He began asking her advice about animal husbandry. They never became lovers, but they became something better, genuine collaborators who respected each other's expertise and enjoyed working together on projects that benefited the mortal world. For Poseidon, the horse project became a turning point. It taught him that his emotional intensity could be an asset rather than a liability when properly channeled. It showed him that patience and sustained effort could produce results that raw power never could. Most importantly, it proved that he could create things worthy of respect and admiration without needing to demand attention through destructive displays. The horses became symbols of Poseidon's evolution as a god. They were powerful but gentle, beautiful but practical, innovative but useful. They represented everything he was capable of when he focused his divine nature on construction rather than destruction. And they gave him something he had been seeking his entire immortal life, a legacy that stood on its own merits rather than in comparison to Zeus's achievements. The fire burns lower now, casting long shadows as we approach the most crucial chapter in Poseidon's story, the decade when he learned the difference between persistence and obsession, between righteous anger and destructive spite. It began with a wooden horse, ironically enough, though not one of Poseidon's creation. The Trojan War had ended with Greek cunning rather than divine intervention, and the victorious heroes were sailing home to claim their rewards. Among them was Odysseus, king of Ithaca, whose cleverness had conceived the trick that finally brought down Troy's walls. Odysseus was exactly the kind of mortal that gods find both fascinating and infuriating. Too clever for his own good, too proud to show proper deference, too successful to be easily dismissed. He had the kind of intelligence that could solve impossible problems and create new ones in the same breath. The trouble started at Troy's sack, when Odysseus committed what seemed like a minor act of sacrilege. In his eagerness to claim victory, he had destroyed one of Poseidon's temples and killed some suppliants who had sought sanctuary there. It was the kind of war crime that happened frequently during the chaos of conquest, usually overlooked in the general celebration of victory. But Poseidon was no longer the god who overlooked slights to his honor. His experiences with Athens, his struggles with anger management, his growing understanding of the importance of respect, all of this had made him more sensitive to how mortals treated divine authority. Odysseus's sacrilege felt personal. Here was a mortal who had achieved great things, won great fame, and felt entitled to ignore the basic protocols of divine courtesy. He represented everything that frustrated Poseidon about mortal hubris, the tendency of successful humans to think they could accomplish anything without properly acknowledging the gods who made their success possible. So Poseidon decided to teach Odysseus a lesson about respect. It was supposed to be simple. A storm that would delay Odysseus's homecoming, cost him some ships, remind him that the seas belonged to Poseidon and not to clever mortals who thought they could take divine protection for granted. The storm hit Odysseus's fleet shortly after they left Troy. Ships were scattered, crews were lost, and Odysseus found himself blown far off course into unknown waters. It should have been a brief but memorable lesson in divine authority. Instead, it became the opening move in a decade-long chess match between a god and a mortal, each one escalating the conflict until what started as a teaching moment became a mutual obsession that consumed both of their lives. Odysseus, instead of accepting his punishment and offering proper sacrifices to appease Poseidon's anger, decided to rely on his own cunning to overcome the divine obstacles in his path. When Poseidon sent storms, Odysseus found ways to navigate through them. When Poseidon arranged for him to be trapped on islands, Odysseus found ways to escape. Each clever solution infuriated Poseidon more than the last. This wasn't just disrespect anymore. This was a mortal actively defying divine will, treating Poseidon's punishments as puzzles to be solved rather than judgments to be accepted. The conflict escalated rapidly. Poseidon stopped trying to teach Odysseus a lesson and started trying to break him completely. He sent the hero to the island of the Cyclops, where Odysseus encountered Polyphemus, Poseidon's son. When Odysseus blinded the Cyclops to escape, the conflict became not just about respect but about family honor. Now Poseidon had a legitimate grievance that went beyond wounded pride. Odysseus had maimed his son. The king of Ithaca wasn't just disrespectful, he was dangerous, a mortal who would injure God's children to serve his own purposes. The pursuit became relentless. Every time Odysseus seemed close to reaching home, Poseidon would intervene with a new obstacle. Sirens who tried to lure him to his death. Whirlpools that could swallow his ship. Monsters that guarded the only safe passages through treacherous waters. But the more obstacles Poseidon created, the more resourceful Odysseus became. The hero who had started this journey as a clever but relatively ordinary king was transforming into something unprecedented, a mortal who could consistently outwit divine opposition. Odysseus learned to read weather patterns well enough to predict Poseidon's storms. He mastered navigation techniques that allowed him to sail through waters that should have been impossible to traverse. He developed diplomatic skills that let him negotiate with monsters and convince gods other than Poseidon to help him. Most infuriatingly, he got better at all of this while Poseidon's tactics remained essentially the same. The god was relying on raw power and divine authority, while the mortal was developing genuine skill and understanding. Years passed. Then more years. Odysseus's wife Penelope waited at home, fending off suitors who assumed her husband was dead. His son Telemachus grew up without a father. His kingdom slowly descended into political chaos. Meanwhile, Poseidon found himself spending more and more of his time and energy on this single mortal. Other aspects of his divine responsibilities began to suffer. His management of sea routes became erratic. His attention to marine ecosystems wavered. His relationships with other gods grew strained as they tired of hearing about his ongoing feud with Odysseus. The worst part was that Poseidon was beginning to realize he might be in the wrong. Not about the original sacrilege, Odysseus had definitely violated proper protocols, but about the proportional response to that violation. Delaying Odysseus's homecoming for a few months would have been appropriate justice. Keeping him away from his family for a decade was starting to look less like divine punishment and more like divine pettiness. But Poseidon couldn't figure out how to end the conflict without looking weak or admitting that he had overreacted. Every day that passed made it harder to back down gracefully. The pursuit of Odysseus had become a matter of divine pride that trapped Poseidon as much as it trapped his target. The resolution came, finally, through exhaustion rather than victory. After 10 years of this cat-and-mouse game across the Mediterranean, both participants were simply tired of fighting. Odysseus had proven his point, that mortal ingenuity could overcome divine opposition if it was persistent and clever enough. He had become the most famous hero of his generation, with a story that would be told for millennia. Poseidon had also proven his point that defying divine authority came with severe consequences. Even Odysseus's eventual triumph was Pyrrhic. He returned home to find his kingdom in chaos, his family traumatized, and most of his original companions dead. But the real lesson was deeper than either of their intended points. The decade-long pursuit had taught both of them about the dangers of letting pride override practical judgment, about the way conflicts can escalate beyond their original causes, and about the heavy cost of refusing to admit when you're wrong. For Poseidon, the Odyssey became a masterclass in the difference between justice and vengeance, between maintaining authority and abusing power. He had been within his rights to punish Odysseus for sacrilege, but he had let his anger transform justified punishment into personal vendetta. The experience forced him to confront some uncomfortable truths about his own nature. His tendency toward disproportionate responses. His difficulty admitting mistakes. His habit of treating personal slights as cosmic injustices that required earth-shaking retaliation. When Odysseus finally reached Ithaca and Poseidon finally let him stay there, both of them had learned something valuable about the art of letting go. Not because either one had achieved complete victory, but because both had discovered that some battles cost more than their worth, even when you're winning them. The Odyssey marked the end of Poseidon's most destructive period as a god. Not because he stopped being powerful or passionate, but because he learned to choose his battles more carefully and to remember that the goal of divine justice was correction, not destruction. It was a lesson that would serve him well in the final phase of his immortal career, as he gradually transformed from the angry god of earthquakes and storms into something more subtle and ultimately more influential, the mature deity who had learned to channel his tempestuous nature into wisdom rather than wrath. The embers have settled into a steady glow, like the deep peace that comes after a storm has passed. Our story draws toward its close as Poseidon finally learns the most important lesson of his immortal life: that true power flows like water, adapting to its container while never losing its essential nature. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Gods don't have dramatic personality reversals any more than mortals do. But the Odyssey had marked a turning point in Poseidon's understanding of himself and his role in the cosmic order. He began to notice patterns in his own behavior that he had been blind to before. The way his anger followed predictable triggers, perceived disrespect, unfavorable comparisons to Zeus, challenges to his authority. The way his responses escalated automatically, without conscious consideration of whether escalation served any useful purpose. Most importantly, he began to understand the difference between being feared and being respected. Fear was what you commanded through overwhelming force. Respect was what you earned through consistent wisdom and fair dealing. For most of his reign, Poseidon had confused the two. He had interpreted fear as a form of respect and had used demonstrations of power to try to earn the kind of regard that actually had to be given freely. The shift started with small changes in how he handled routine divine business. When mortals forgot to offer proper sacrifices before sea voyages, instead of sending immediate storms, he would let them experience gradually worsening weather until they figured out what they had forgotten. When cities built harbors without consulting his priests, instead of destroying them with earthquakes, he would allow engineering problems to develop that made it clear divine guidance would have been helpful. These subtler approaches took more patience and finesse than his old methods, but they were also more effective. Mortals who learned lessons gradually were more likely to remember them permanently. Communities that discovered the value of divine guidance through experience were more likely to seek it voluntarily in the future. Poseidon also began paying more attention to positive reinforcement. Instead of focusing primarily on punishing those who ignored him, he started making sure that those who honored him properly received obvious and substantial benefits. Sailors who followed proper protocols found themselves blessed with perfectly timed winds and unusually calm seas. Fishermen who offered appropriate sacrifices discovered that their nets filled with prize catches that could feed entire villages. Coastal cities that built beautiful temples in his honor enjoyed protection from storms and earthquakes that devastated their less devout neighbors. The results were dramatic. Worship of Poseidon increased significantly, but more importantly, the quality of that worship improved. Instead of desperate prayers offered during emergencies, he began receiving thoughtful consultation on maritime projects, artistic tributes that showed genuine appreciation for his aesthetic sensibilities, and philosophical treatises that explored the deeper meanings of his dominion over the seas. For the first time in his divine career, Poseidon felt like he was being worshipped for who he actually was rather than for what mortals feared he might do to them. This shift in his relationship with mortals had ripple effects throughout his divine relationships as well. Other gods, who had grown tired of dealing with his explosive temper and disproportionate responses, began seeking his counsel on matters related to his expertise. Demeter consulted him about irrigation projects that could improve agricultural yields. Athena asked for his input on harbor designs that could enhance urban planning. Even Zeus occasionally sought his brother's perspective on weather patterns that affected both sky and sea. These collaborative relationships were deeply satisfying in ways that Poseidon hadn't expected. For so long, he had focused on competing with other gods for authority and recognition. Now he was discovering the pleasure of working with them toward shared goals, contributing his unique expertise to projects that none of them could have completed alone. The relationship with Zeus, in particular, began to evolve in healthier directions. The desperate need to prove himself as worthy as his younger brother gradually gave way to a more mature understanding of their different but complementary roles in the cosmic order. Zeus was the king, yes, but kingdoms need more than just kings. They need specialists, advisors, administrators who understand the complexities of their particular domains. Poseidon was never going to be the supreme ruler of the universe, but he was the unquestioned master of the seas, and that mastery was genuinely valuable rather than consolation prize. This realization allowed Poseidon to take pride in his achievements without constantly measuring them against Zeus's accomplishments. The underwater civilizations he had built were marvels of engineering and social organization. The marine ecosystems he had developed supported an incredible diversity of life. The weather systems he managed kept ocean currents flowing in patterns that benefited the entire planet. These were significant contributions to the stability and beauty of the cosmos, worthy of respect in their own right rather than as lesser versions of Zeus's celestial achievements. Perhaps most importantly, Poseidon began to understand his own nature in more sophisticated ways. His emotional intensity, which had been such a source of problems when expressed as anger, was actually his greatest strength when channeled into creativity and passion. The horses he had created for Demeter were proof of what he could accomplish when his feelings motivated construction rather than destruction. His development of new sea creatures showed how emotional investment could drive innovation. His most beautiful underwater palaces had been built during periods when he was deeply moved by love, wonder, or artistic inspiration. Poseidon's temperamental nature wasn't a flaw to be suppressed. It was a source of power to be directed wisely. He would never be as coolly rational as Athena or as diplomatically smooth as Hermes. But he could be passionate, creative, and deeply committed to the things he cared about, and those qualities had their own value in the divine community. The mature Poseidon who emerged from these realizations was still recognizably the same god who had raged against his father, competed desperately with his siblings, and pursued Odysseus across the Mediterranean for a decade. But he had learned to express his essential nature in ways that created more than they destroyed, that built relationships rather than burning them down. He still got angry when mortals showed disrespect or when other gods overstepped into his domain. But his anger had become more focused, more proportional, more likely to result in justice than chaos. He still felt competitive with Zeus and occasionally frustrated by his secondary position in the divine hierarchy. But he had found sources of satisfaction and pride that didn't depend on outranking his brother or proving himself superior in head-to-head competition. Most importantly, he had learned to work with his nature rather than against it. Instead of trying to suppress his emotional intensity or pretending to be someone he wasn't, he had found ways to channel his fundamental characteristics into expressions that served both his own needs and the broader good of the cosmos. The god who had once shaken the earth in fury now made waves that carried trade ships safely between ports. The deity who had once sent storms to punish disrespect now sent rains to nourish the crops that fed the world. The immortal who had once competed desperately for recognition had become confident enough in his own worth to focus on doing his job well, rather than making sure everyone noticed how well he was doing it. Poseidon had learned, finally, how to flow. The fire has burned down to its last few glowing coals, casting gentle warmth as our long story finds its end. Poseidon's tale doesn't conclude with thunderous triumph or dramatic tragedy, but with something rarer and more valuable: the quiet satisfaction of a life lived with growing wisdom. In the end, Poseidon never did overthrow Zeus or claim the supreme throne of the cosmos. He never achieved the kind of obvious, visible dominance that had once seemed so important to his sense of self-worth. He remained, to the end of his story, the god of the seas while his younger brother ruled the sky. But somewhere along his immortal journey, this stopped feeling like failure and started feeling like home. Poseidon found his peace not in changing his circumstances, but in understanding them differently. The seas were not a lesser domain than the heavens. They were a different domain, with their own beauty, their own importance, their own infinite complexity. The role of Sea Lord was not a consolation prize. It was a calling that matched his temperament, his abilities, and his deepest nature. The god who had spent millennia trying to prove he was as important as Zeus discovered something more valuable. He was important as himself. His contributions to the cosmic order were unique, necessary, and worthy of pride. His dominion over the waters touched every aspect of life on Earth, from the rain that watered crops to the currents that carried ships between distant shores. Modern mortals, who no longer build temples in his honor or pour wine into the sea before sailing, still live in a world shaped by his influence. Every time rain falls to end a drought, every time ocean currents moderate the planet's climate, every time horses run with fluid grace across fields and beaches, Poseidon's legacy continues. His story resonates because the challenges he faced are eternal human challenges. The struggle to find your place in a family. The difficulty of living up to your potential while accepting your limitations. The lifelong work of learning to channel intense emotions into constructive rather than destructive expressions. Poseidon's journey from angry young god to wise elder deity mirrors the path that many of us walk in our own lives. The recognition that competing with others is less satisfying than developing your own abilities. The understanding that being respected matters more than being feared. The discovery that your greatest strengths and your most troublesome weaknesses are often the same characteristics, expressed differently. Perhaps most importantly, Poseidon's story reminds us that growth is possible at any stage of life, even for immortal beings who seem set in their ways. The god who once solved problems with earthquakes learned to solve them with patience and wisdom. The deity who once demanded recognition learned to earn respect. The immortal who once fought against his nature learned to work with it. The seas still rage during storms, but they also cradle ships safely through calm passages. They still claim lives during tsunamis, but they also sustain countless forms of life in their depths. They are powerful enough to reshape continents, but gentle enough to support the smallest sea creatures. Like the god who rules them, the oceans embody the paradox of force that has learned restraint, passion that has found wisdom, power that serves rather than dominates. So close your eyes now and listen to the rhythm of your own breathing. Feel it slow and deepen, like waves settling into their eternal pattern. Let the warmth from these final embers remind you that even the most tempestuous fires eventually bank down into steady, sustaining heat. Poseidon's story is complete, but the lessons it teaches flow on like the tides, eternal, cyclical, always returning to nourish the shores of human understanding. The god of the seas has taught us that it's possible to be powerful without being destructive, passionate without being chaotic, competitive without being bitter. He has shown us that our greatest struggles often become our greatest teachers, and that the very characteristics that cause us the most trouble can become our most valuable assets when properly understood and directed. Rest now, knowing that somewhere beyond the horizon, the eternal tides continue their ancient dance between shore and sea, storm and calm, the fury of youth and the wisdom of age. The waves that crash against distant beaches carry the same energy that once shook the foundations of the earth, but channeled now into rhythms that sustain rather than destroy. Poseidon's vigil over the waters continues, patient and eternal, a reminder that even gods can learn to grow, to change, to become better versions of themselves while remaining true to their essential nature. The story ends as all the best stories do, not with simple answers, but with deeper questions to carry into your dreams. How do we channel our own stormy natures into forces for good? How do we find peace with our place in the world while still striving to improve it? How do we learn to flow like water around obstacles while maintaining the power to carve our own channels through the landscape of life? These are questions worthy of gods and mortals alike. Questions that echo in the sound of waves against the shore, in the rhythm of falling rain, in the patient persistence of water finding its way to the sea. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers. May your rest be as deep as the ocean depths and your dreams as vast as the endless sea.